Hello everyone, today's poem is Wang Feng Shu Li, a poem from the Book of Songs. This poem is quite famous and it also became a special term to express the sorrow of the lost, ruined homeland. So whenever you want to express the feelings for your ruined hometown, for your lost hometown, you can see 黍离之恨, the sorrow of 黍离. So that's all from this poem. And sometimes plus another poem's title, 麦秀, which talks about the same feelings, same thoughts, the lost, the sorrow to the ruined homeland. So it's a little bit patriotism, it's a little bit sorrow. So it's a very complicated feeling combined, and that feeling was defined by this poem and with another poem, 麦秀. So you can always say 黍离麦秀之恨, the sorrow of 黍离 and 麦秀. Before we get to the poem, let's talk about something about the title of the subchapter, Wang Feng, the King's Wind. So this is quite special state's wind among the 15 states wind, because normally the state's wind is the sounds from the states, and the king, the state of the king is the capital, or the area surround the capital. So it's not a state, it's the capital. So the poem written by the people in the capital, or the people of the capital, they are categorized in the subchapter 大雅 and 小雅. So we have a lot of the poems from 大雅 and 小雅, and they consist a bunch of the quantities in the Book of Songs. Roughly half of the poems are from 大雅 and 小雅. So we can see even the capital and the area surround the capital is not so big compared to all the country, but they are the most civilized place. The people are the most educated people, and thus they created with much fewer people, much less landscape, but they created the poems with quantity that compete with the 15 states wind. And what's more, the poems is much more complicated and much more longer, which all means they are more sophisticated, they are well educated compared to those stage winds. And the poems in the stage winds is much rather like folk songs. So when we're reading the poems in the stage wind, the wording is quite simple, and it's not very long. It's just like three quite similar paragraphs repeating most of the words. So normally that's the typical structure in the stage wind. But the hard part is how to understand what the folk song was about. So it was deeply rooted in the local environment, the culture, the landscape, the folk stories whatsoever. So it's much more difficult to understand when compared to the poems in 大雅 and 小雅, because 大雅 and 小雅normally are not associated with the local folk stories or local features, some of the local features, the landscape, the people, the atmosphere, the weather, whatsoever. So, but it's more of about some of the very dedicated person or some of the very dedicated things. So even the wording is very, very sophisticated. The poem is quite long, but it's much, much more easier to be understood by us, by today's people. So when we're reading the poems in the stage wind, the most important things is to dig into the history background as much as we could, dig into the culture, the folk stories, all the things associated with the food, the lifestyles, everything, anything you could dig into, and then that will greatly help to understand the poems in the stage winds. With both the Chinese classic literature and modern archaeology, we know much better of the time, of the situation, of the culture of the Zhou dynasty, especially the West Zhou dynasty. But still, there is too much we still don't know. So that means when we're reading the stage wind, there is too much things in the background that we don't know at all. So this brings the problems that when we're reading the poems in the stage wind, even the wording is so simple, but it's still so hard for us to understand what it's talking about. So that's the situation we should know when we're reading the poems in the stage wind. And for this stage wind, Wang Feng, the king's wind, is quite special stage wind because the state is the capital, or the city was so called as Wangcheng. It's in the Luoyang city today. So you can see the map. It was normally so called as the east capital of the Zhou dynasty. In general, the poems by the people in the capital area should be categorized to the chapter of Daya and Xiaoya, right? How could the poems be categorized to a state wind, so called as Wang Feng, the king's wind? So they treated the people in the capital as those other states. How could it be? So make it in short, it's because of the big changeover in the history. So at the end of the West Zhou dynasty, the capital was always in the area near Xi'an city today. You can see the map. The capital was destroyed and ruined. The king was killed. And after some years of uncertainty, a new king ascended the throne as the city of Wangcheng in the east capital, in the city about this subchapter, Wang Feng. So since then, the East Zhou dynasty starts. But anyhow, everything is not the same as before. The king lost his army, he lost his power, and he lost his ruling over the other states. So even somehow, most of the states still regard him as the king of the whole country. But in reality, they behave standalone, and the king just behaved as a normal state quite similar to other states, not as a superpower, not as the ruler, the utmost ruler over the country. So that could be the fundamental reason why the poems was categorized as the state's winds. And a lot of the traditions built in the West Zhou dynasty was lost gradually. The Book of Songs is one of them. Just when the East Zhou starts, roughly through three generations of kings, three kings, they never continue the tradition of the Book of Songs, which means people still wrote poems, but the poems are not collected, refined, and finally put up into the Book of Songs. So basically, most of us believe that only after three kings in the East Zhou dynasty, there is no more poems was added into the Book of Songs, and finally the Book of Songs became a fixed version, never change or never add poems into it again. And the work, the duty to collect, to refine the poems and make the book of the Book of Songs is the duty of the central government. So that's one of the duties of the central government. So from the Book of Songs, we can also feel that the regime, the power of the king was totally lost. The second king of the East Zhou dynasty even had a war with another states. In the past, those states are under him and follow every order of the king. And in the East Zhou dynasty, they don't listen to the king, and they even dare to have a combat with the king and wounded the king finally. So you can see how the East Zhou dynasty it was, and how the power of the king was totally lost. That was also reflected in the poems in the King's Wind, which normally the humble, the sadness, the sorrow, and some of the poor life was reflected in the King's Winds is quite different from those in the Daya and Xiaoya. So this could be the second reason that the poems was not categorized in the Daya and Xiaoya, and it was treated, or it was leveled to the state's wind. As far as we know the history background, it's quite easy for us to understand what it is about in the first poem in King's Wind, 黍离, of this poem. It's about the sorrow of their lost, their ruined old capital, which was so called as Zhou, which is near Xi'an city today. Okay, let's get to the poem. 黍离, the first paragraph. 彼黍离离，彼稷之苗，行迈靡靡，中心摇摇。Those are the millet crops. They are so prosperous and shining. They are the seedling of the millet crops. I come along such a long way to here, and it's hard for me to go any longer. And my heart, my feeling is swaying and shaking. Okay, let's get to the words. So those words are all famous and so popular, used still today. So it's a very, very famous poem. 黍离彼黍离离, Shu is the millet. So this is the main crops for the Zhou people. The character 季 in the second sentence, 彼稷之苗, also refers to the millet, but it's a different kind because the Zhou people, they are very talented farmers. They distinguish all kinds of the millet. Normally, the ji was taken as yellow millet, or someone think it's the millet very sticky, the most sticky millet. But anyhow, it's not a big deal. Just remember, ji is the best, most favorite kind of millet for Zhou people. And the Zhou people use Ji, the temple of Ji, as the equivalent term of the country. So you can see how these crops is so important for the Zhou people. The temple of the millet is equivalent to the country, to the throne. So the first sentence gave us a very vivid, typical starting in the Book of Songs, describing some of the scenic views surrounding. And the background is a senior officer, or maybe not a senior officer, who lives in the Wangcheng, in the king's city today, and he went back to their ruined old capital, Zhongzhou, where is near Xi'an city today, and he saw the ruined temple, the ruined palace, and which became a farming field, and the millet crops, the millet seedling, grows so prosperously. So that's a huge contrast, and that of course definitely aroused the sorrow of this guy, because he used to live here, or maybe his father, his grandfather used to live here, and he knows the magnificent, how glorious this place it was used to be, the palaces, the temples, the prosperous populations, the magnificent landscape. So he know all the stories from his father, from his grandmother, from his mother, and even from the Book of Songs. So the poems in 大雅, 小雅, most of them are all written based on the environment, the landscape, the people in this area. So that's the pride of the Zhou people, of course. And today, when he came back to this place, it's all ruined, and it became a prosperous farming field. What a big, huge contrast. 彼稷之苗 also implies that himself is the descendant of the Zhou people, because Ji is also the name of the very first ancestor of the Zhou people, 后稷, 彼稷之苗. So that was the descendants of 后稷. So that is a very strong implication that he indicated himself, the poet himself, I'm the descendants of the Zhou people. I'm the descendant of the Hoji. So just with the simple sentence, the first simple sentence, there's so many meanings as far as you know the history background. If you don't know the history background, there's nothing, just the millet crops. So the second sentence is quite easy to understand. 行迈靡靡, so he crossed a long way, some 5 to 600 kilometers from the east capital to the ruined west capital here. Mimi, so Mimi normally was explained as hesitation or something, but Mi was always explained as no, none of in the Book of Songs. So here, actually, I think we could still use that meaning, the none of, to explain in this place. So I come a long way from the east capital to the ruined old capital, and no, I just can't get along with it. I just can't do nothing, and my heart was shaking, swing left, swing right. So it's a status of wandering. It's a status of he was totally lost. So that was such a huge contrast that so many people died during the changeover from the West Zhou dynasty to the East Zhou dynasty. So many wealth was destroyed. So many family was totally terminated. And not to say the landscape, the palaces, the temples, the ancestors' temples was destroyed here. So the poet, when he saw all this, he was totally lost. Zhong Xin is, in today's words, is Xin Zhong. So that's the writing, the way of writing in the Book of Songs. In today's language, 中心 means the center. It has nothing to do with the heart. And here it means in the most center of my heart, or in today's language, 心中. Another interesting word is 离离. You can see my detailed explanation in the video, 渐渐之时. So 离 basically means shining twice, so which means it shines and then goes to dark and then shines again. So this is quite the status of the prosperous crops under the sun. And when it's waving, the crops, when you stare at some delicate place, it sometimes in the shadow goes dark, sometimes it was shined by the sun, and it's shining, the reflection of the light shining later. So when the crops waving, it becomes dark and shining, and then dark again, and then shining. So that's a very, very how to put it, sometimes makes people lost, and sometimes it's so mysterious. So you can everybody could have his own feeling or explanation, but so that's my thinking or my feeling about this poem. Just feel it again. 彼黍离离, those prosperous crops waving and shining, and they are the seedling of the millet crops. I came a long way to the ruined palaces, temples, and a voice in my heart is shouting, no, I cannot get along with it. I cannot do anything. I cannot hear anything. I cannot talk anything. just no. And my heart turn left, turn right, waving and shaking. I'm totally lost. So at the very moment, maybe the poet even don't feel the sorrow, don't feel the sadness. He was totally lost. Okay, let's continue. The very famous sentence, remember it. 知我者，谓我心忧；不知我者，谓我何求？悠悠苍天，此何人哉？ The people who know of me, they know I'm so worried. And the people who don't know of me, they just say, what are you talking about? What are you looking about? What are you looking for? Because in the first two pair sentences, we can imagine when the poet came to the right place of the ruined palaces, the ruined temples, he looks totally lost. He was wandering, step back and forth, swim right and left, and his face looks like he was totally lost. So if someone came along with him, or someone besides him, when they looked at the poet, they will say, what's wrong with you? It's just an ordinary millet farming field, and it's just a normal day. What's wrong with this guy? And the last pair of sentence is just like this. The poet asked to the heaven, the God, the vast and long heaven, please tell me who this guy he was. So very likely when he showed up at the place, he was totally lost. He feels such a sorrow. Very likely nobody understood him. And finally he just signed, he just complied, or he just shouting at the heaven, shouting to the God, who am I? So finally the sadness burst out. Now the second paragraph. The second paragraph and the third paragraph are almost identical to the first paragraph. Let's go through it first. 彼黍离离，彼稷之穗，行迈靡靡，中心如醉。知我者，谓我心忧；不知我者，谓我何求？悠悠苍天，此何人哉？ So the only difference is the last word of the first sentence and the last word of the second sentence. Those 彼黍离离，彼稷之穗，穗 is the millet sprays. So in the first paragraph, it was referred as the seedling of the millet, which actually is the early springtime, right? And in the second paragraph, it was referred as the millet sprays, which should be around the late summer or early August. So in the second paragraph, nothing changed, but the time has been changed. The millet grows and it's became mature. It's almost a harvest time. And again, the poet come to the millet field and the millet field still prospers and is shining, and the poet is still walk a long way, and he was so reluctant to come such a long way, and he was just like drunk. 中心如醉，醉 is drunk. So it used a different word, but I think the status or the situation was described is quite similar, like the first paragraph. This guy was totally lost, so it's drunk. So in the second paragraph, it is described as he was drunk fully in his heart. And then the third, fourth, and the fifth pair of sentences is all same. The people who know of me, he know what I'm worried about. He know I'm worrying. And the people who don't know me, he just wondering what's this guy is about. What's up? He looks so stupid. He looks wondering. Over here in a quite normal place, he just wandering a step back and forth all the time. What happens to this guy? And finally, the poet challenged to the heaven, to the God. Who am I finally? Who am I? 此何人哉? The third paragraph changed 2 words as well. 彼黍离离，彼稷之实. The prosperous millet crops waving and shining. That's the grains of the millet. So this 实 means the millet spray has fully matured. It's just before the harvest, or it's the time of harvest. 实 means is the grain was solid and fulfilled in the shell. 彼稷之实，行迈靡靡，中心如黍。黍 means the throat was shut down. The throat was shut, so there's no breath go through. And so here it's not wandering, lost. It's utmost sadness. He wants to cry, but his throat was locked, shut. He cannot let his profound, huge sadness go through with his crying. He even cannot cry here. So from the first paragraph to the third paragraph, the time changed from the spring to the autumn's time. The millet crops grows from the seedling to fully matured, grown up, and the sadness grows as well. At the very beginning, the poet was totally lost. He might not know very well what's it about. He even may not notice the sadness, or he even don't know there is some huge sadness beneath. So he just appeared. He was so worried. He was totally lost. And in the second paragraph, the millet grows, and he's wandering, he's lost still, but it's much worse. He was just like drunk. So it's a sickness, right? In the Chinese, old Chinese way, the drunk, a very heavy drunk, is a sickness. It's not normal already. It's just it's not a normal wandering. It's not a normally lost. It's a bit sickness. But still, we don't feel the sadness, or the poet may still don't notice there is something about sadness within him, within his heart. And in the third paragraph, finally, everything was fully matured. The millet sprays and the huge sadness. He wants to cry, but the depressed sadness, the long-term sadness was so big, it's gigantic. He even cannot cry out. His throat was locked and shut. So this is a very talent writing and with profound feelings. So 黍离, remember the term 黍离, it resembled the part of the patriotism, but mainly for the sadness of the lost homeland, for the lost country. There are still some of the arguments about this poem and about the background of this poem. So normally we think this poet went back to the ruined capital on his duty. But how could he stay there for months from the early spring to the autumn? So normally a normal duty would never last for months. How could he stay there for months over there at a place of nowhere? So someone said this poem could be written all by his imagination. So the poet could have been to the old capital once, and then he returned. But when he was writing this poem, he imagined another two scenarios, maybe the summer's time, maybe the autumn time. He just write it by his imagination. While I have a totally different opinion, because the poems in the Zhou dynasty, they are so realistic. So they never write about some of the imaginations. So I do believe the three seasons, spring, summer, and autumn, was all the real cases. The poet had paid a visit to the millet field. Anyhow, I do believe it's really hard or impossible for him to go to the field in the old capital, in the Zhou city. Very likely, the field he had been to is the field near the new capital, near the king's city. With my hypothesis, the poet visited the field many times is feasible. It's not a big deal. Still, with this hypothesis, the feelings or the emotions doesn't change too much, because the millet always resembles to their ancestor or implies to their ancestor 后继. And in the very first sentences, he pointed out very, very clearly 彼稷之苗. That was the descendants of the my old, very ancient ancestors, 后继. So it doesn't change too much, and very likely the poet recalled to his ancestors 后继 recalled to their ruined old capital, Zhou city. And this is also a very, very typical situation in the Chinese 物是人非, which means the millet is still the millet. It was generations by generations, is still that object, but the people, the person has changed. It's a signing of time changing. It's a signing of the lost life and lost glory. So this is this poem about. So finally, the last puzzle for everyone. Who was this guy? Or what kind of a person this poet was? 此何人哉? So my answer is, he very likely is a prince. He asked to the heaven directly, and we still can feel that he has a very, very broad view. He has some of the visions, and his vision was not understood by the most of the people, right? 不知我者为我何求? So that's very likely is the situation of a prince or even a king's situation. He was quite familiar with their glory, and he was well known of how to rule a country. But at the current status, they lost all their foundations, their troops, their wealth. They have no people, no resources to get back to their previous glory. What a sadness it is. Okay, that's for today. And remember 黍离麦秀. So that's a very complicated feeling and situation. Bye bye for now.